Listen carefully, because many men exhaust themselves fighting something they have never taken the time to understand. When a man feels pressure inside himself, his instinct is to resist it, to push harder, to overpower it. He believes that strength means opposition, that if something feels heavy or uncomfortable, the correct response is force. But force without understanding is blind, and blind force does not weaken an inner struggle, it feeds it. Whatever you struggle against without clarity does not disappear. It adapts. It grows more clever. It finds new ways to speak, new reasons to justify itself. When a man reacts without understanding, he gives energy to the very thing he wants to escape. Resistance alone keeps the struggle alive. While most inner conflicts are not enemies, they are signals. They are messages asking to be understood, not attacked. But a man who has never been taught to listen interprets every signal as a threat. He tenses, he braces, he fights, and in doing so, he stays locked in the same loop. Think of how often a man says, "I need to get rid of this fear," or "I need to stop thinking like this." That language already assumes war. But war implies two sides, and when you split yourself in two, you weaken both. The mind does not respond well to violence directed inward. It responds to clarity. When something inside you grows stronger, the more you resist it, that is a sign you are feeding it incorrectly. Struggle gives attention, attention gives energy, and energy gives persistence. This is why certain thoughts return again and again, not because they are true, but because they are constantly engaged. A wise man learns to pause before reacting. He does not rush to suppress what arises. He watches it, he studies it. He asks what it is protecting, what it is afraid of losing, what story it is trying to preserve. This observation drains power from the struggle, because confusion is its fuel. Confusion makes everything feel urgent. It makes emotions feel dangerous. It makes thoughts feel authoritative. But clarity slows things down. Clarity separates sensation from meaning, feeling from interpretation, reaction from choice. Many men believe that if they stop fighting their inner tension, they will become weak. The opposite is true. When you stop fighting blindly, you start seeing precisely. And precision is real strength. An unexamined struggle feels endless. An understood struggle feels finite. Once you understand why a pattern exists, you stop personalizing it. You stop asking, "What is wrong with me?" and start asking, "What is this trying to do?" That shift alone dissolves much of its grip. A wise man understands that inner resistance often comes from misalignment, not defect. Fear appears when a man is moving beyond what is familiar. Doubt appears when identity is being challenged. Restlessness appears when attention is scattered. These are not enemies to crush, they are indicators to interpret. When a man tries to overpower these signals, he becomes tense. He hardens. He loses sensitivity. And in losing sensitivity, he loses clarity. He may look strong from the outside, but internally he is brittle. Clarity softens without weakening. It allows a man to see the mechanics of his inner world. He notices how certain thoughts trigger certain emotions, how those emotions push him towards certain behaviors. Once seen, the pattern no longer feels mysterious, and what is no longer mysterious loses its intimidation. Struggle thrives on darkness, on vagueness, on stories that are never questioned. The moment light is applied, the struggle must either justify itself or fade. Most cannot justify themselves. This is why insight often brings relief even before change happens. Understanding releases pressure. It tells the nervous system that the situation is no longer unknown, and the unknown is what creates panic. A man who understands his inner patterns no longer wastes energy trying to dominate them. He redirects energy toward alignment. He stops asking how to defeat what is inside him and starts asking how to integrate it wisely. This does not mean indulging every impulse or believing every thought. It means recognizing their origin. A thought born from fear does not deserve the same authority as a thought born from clarity. But you can only tell the difference if you are paying attention. Strength without clarity creates exhaustion. Clarity without strength creates passivity. But clarity first allows strength to be applied correctly. It tells you where effort matters and where it is wasted. A wise man conserves his strength. He does not spend it fighting shadows. He uses it to act deliberately once understanding is established. He waits for clarity, not as delay, but as preparation. Over time, the inner struggle weakens not because it has been crushed, but because it has been understood. The urgency fades, the tension loosens. What once felt overwhelming becomes manageable, and what is manageable no longer controls behavior. This is the quiet truth most men never learn. The inner struggle survives on misunderstanding, not power. And the moment a man chooses clarity over resistance, the fight begins to end. Let me tell you something that may challenge what you were taught about strength. Most men believe strength means endurance, force, and the ability to push through anything. They pride themselves on holding more weight, tolerating more pressure, and remaining unshaken. But there is a kind of strength that looks impressive on the outside and quietly collapses on the inside. This is what happens when strength is applied without clarity. A confused mind will always misuse strength. It will push when it should pause, resist when it should listen, and endure when it shall. LD, change direction. And because the man believes he is being strong, he does not notice that he is slowly exhausting himself. Confusion does not announce itself loudly. It disguises itself as urgency. It creates the feeling that everything must be solved now, that every emotion must be reacted to, that every thought demands a response. In this state, strength becomes frantic. A man pushes harder not because it is wise, but because he does not know what else to do. This is why so many strong men feel internally unstable. They have learned how to endure discomfort, but not how to understand it. They have trained their willpower, but not their awareness. And willpower without understanding becomes force applied in the wrong direction. A man with a confused mind mistakes tension for purpose. He feels pressure and assumes it means he must act immediately. He feels resistance and assumes he must overpower it. But tension is not instruction. Resistance is not always an obstacle. Sometimes it is information. When clarity is missing, strength turns against the man himself. He becomes rigid. He stops adapting. He stops listening. He mistakes stubbornness for discipline, and slowly his strength becomes brittle. You can see this in how men handle failure. Without clarity, failure feels like a personal attack. Strength responds by doubling down blindly, repeating the same behavior with more force. With clarity, failure becomes feedback. Strength then adjusts, refines, and evolves. Confusion narrows vision. It makes everything feel binary: succeed or fail, fight or quit, win or lose. In that narrow frame, strength has very few options. It either pushes forward recklessly or shuts down completely. Neither leads to mastery. A wise man understands that strength is not meant to be constant pressure. It is meant to be applied precisely. Precision requires clarity. Without clarity, even great strength becomes wasteful. Think of how often a man says, "I'll just power through this," without stopping to ask whether powering through is actually required. Sometimes endurance is courage. Other times it is avoidance disguised as toughness. A confused mind cannot tell the difference. This is why emotional confusion is so dangerous. When a man does not understand what he is feeling, he reacts to it impulsively. Anger becomes aggression. Fear becomes control. Sadness becomes withdrawal. Strength amplifies these reactions, making the consequences heavier. Clarity does not weaken emotion. It organizes it. It allows a man to feel fully without being ruled by feeling. It separates sensation from meaning. It tells him, "You are experiencing this, but this is not the whole truth." When clarity is present, strength becomes calm. It does not rush. It does not need to prove itself. It waits until action aligns with understanding. This kind of strength lasts. A confused mind also misidentifies the problem. It attacks symptoms instead of causes. It fights discomfort instead of examining why it exists. And because the root remains untouched, the struggle returns, stronger, louder, more persistent. This creates a cycle where a man feels constantly under attack by his own inner world. He becomes defensive with himself. He tightens, he hardens, and in hardening, he loses sensitivity. Sensitivity is not weakness. It is the ability to detect what actually needs attention. A wise man does not fear sensitivity. He knows that clarity depends on it. You cannot understand something you refuse to feel, and you cannot guide strength wisely if you are numb to your own internal signals. Confusion also distorts identity. A man begins to define himself by his struggle. This is just how I am. I'm always like this. Strength then becomes a prison, holding an identity in place, rather than allowing growth. Clarity breaks this spell by reminding the man that patterns are learned, not fixed. When clarity enters, strength becomes flexible. It adapts. It knows when to press forward and when to step back. It knows when to speak and when to stay silent. It knows when effort is needed and when rest is wiser. This is why the calm man often outlasts the intense one. Calm is not lack of strength. It is strength guided by understanding. Intensity burns fuel quickly. Clarity conserves it. A wise man trains his clarity first. He learns to observe his inner state before acting. He notices when his mind is rushed, when his emotions are inflamed, when his thoughts are scattered. In those moments, he does not demand more strength from himself. He demands more understanding. Once understanding is present, strength becomes effective again. It knows its role. It serves direction instead of chaos. This is the truth most men never hear. Strength does not solve confusion. It exposes it. And when confusion is leading, strength only accelerates the wrong outcome. But when clarity leads, strength becomes unstoppable. And this is why the man who learns to steady his mind will always outlast the man who only learns to push. Let me guide you gently into this, because this is where real clarity is born, and where most men either wake up or remain trapped in the same inner loop for years. The moment a thought appears, most men obey it without realizing they have done so. The thought says, "This is bad," and the body tenses. It says, "You're not ready," and the man hesitates. It says, "You must defend yourself," and anger rises. There is no pause, no distance, no examination. The thought speaks, and action follows. This is not thinking, this is reflex. Clarity begins the moment a man learns to observe a thought without immediately submitting to it. This sounds simple, but it is not easy, because the mind has trained itself for speed. It has learned to react instantly in the name of survival. But what once protected you can later imprison you if it is never questioned. A thought is not a command, it is an event. It appears, lingers briefly, and disappears unless it is fed. But most men feed their thoughts automatically. They argue with them, justify them, act on them, or try to suppress them. All of these reactions give the thought importance. Observation, on the other hand, does something very different. It removes urgency. When a man observes a thought without obeying it, he creates space. In that space, clarity breathes. At first, this feels uncomfortable. A man may notice thoughts that contradict the image he has of himself. He may hear fear where he expected confidence, resentment where he expected strength, insecurity where he expected certainty. The instinct is to push these thoughts away or label them as weakness. But a wise man does not run from what appears. He watches it calmly. Observation is not agreement. It is not surrender. It is simply seeing. The moment a man sees a thought clearly, it loses the illusion of authority. It is no longer "I am afraid." It becomes "fear is present." That shift may seem small, but it changes everything. One is identity. The other is experience. And a man can guide an experience, but he is trapped by an identity. Most inner confusion comes from identification. A man thinks he is his thoughts. He thinks he is his emotions. He thinks he is his impulses. And because of this, every thought feels personal. Every emotion feels final. Every impulse feels urgent. Observation breaks this spell. When a man learns to sit with a thought without reacting, he begins to notice patterns. He sees how certain thoughts appear in predictable situations, before challenge, before rest, before connection, before growth. These thoughts are not random. They are conditioned responses. And conditioned responses can be retrained. A wise man understands that the mind often speaks in absolutes. Always. Never. Everyone. No one. These words sound convincing, but they are rarely accurate. Observation exposes exaggeration. It reveals how the mind dramatizes to create urgency. Once seen, exaggeration loses power. There is another quiet truth here. The thoughts that demand immediate obedience are usually the ones that deserve the most distance. Urgency is not wisdom. It is often fear wearing the mask of importance. When a man observes instead of obeys, he regains authorship. He may still feel the pull of the thought, but he is no longer dragged by it. He can choose his response deliberately, and choice is the foundation of clarity. This does not mean a man becomes passive or detached from life. On the contrary, he becomes more engaged, because his actions are no longer hijacked by unconscious reactions. He acts with alignment rather than impulse. Observation also changes how a man relates to discomfort. Instead of trying to escape it immediately, he stays present long enough to understand it. He notices how discomfort rises, peaks, and falls. He realizes that emotions are temporary unless reinforced by interpretation. This realization alone softens suffering. Many men fear that if they stop reacting to their thoughts, they will lose motivation or intensity. The opposite happens. Reaction drains energy. Observation preserves it. When a man is no longer arguing internally all day, his energy returns. Clarity brings calm, not because life becomes easy, but because the inner noise quiets. A wise man also understands that observation must be practiced gently. Aggressive self-monitoring creates tension. Curiosity creates insight. The tone matters. You are not interrogating your mind, you are learning its language. Over time, something remarkable happens. Thoughts that once controlled behavior begin to lose frequency. Not because they were fought, but because they were no longer rewarded with obedience. The mind adapts. It offers fewer alarms when alarms are not acted upon blindly. This is how inner leadership is built, not through domination, but through presence. Observation also reveals something humbling. Many thoughts are recycled. They are not fresh insights, they are echoes. The same fears, the same doubts, the same stories repeating with different details. Seeing this repetition breaks the illusion of importance. A man realizes he has been responding to the same script for years. And once a script is recognized, it can be rewritten. A wise man does not demand silence from his mind. He demands honesty. He allows thoughts to speak, but he chooses which ones lead. He understands that clarity does not come from thinking more, but from seeing more clearly. This practice changes how a man meets the world. Criticism no longer penetrates as deeply because he can observe his reaction before accepting the story. Failure no longer defines him because he can observe disappointment without turning it into identity. Success no longer inflates him because he can observe pride without being owned by it. This is inner stability. Clarity is not a state you reach and keep forever. It is a relationship you maintain. Some days are clearer than others. A wise man does not judge himself for this. He simply returns to observation, because every time he observes without obeying, he strengthens the one thing that truly matters, his ability to choose consciously, and the man who can choose his response is no longer ruled by his inner noise. Let me speak to you calmly here, because fear is often misunderstood, and misunderstanding is what gives it its strength. Fear does not arrive as an enemy announcing itself. It arrives as concern, as caution, as logic, as responsibility. It presents itself as the voice that wants to protect you, to keep you safe, to prevent pain. And because of this, most men do not question it. They respect it. They listen to it. They obey it. Not realizing that fear only becomes powerful when it remains unclear. Fear thrives in vagueness. It grows in shadows. It becomes overwhelming when it is felt but not examined. A man feels tension in his chest, hesitation in his body, resistance in his mind, and he calls it fear, but he never asks what it is actually pointing to. So it stays large, undefined, and intimidating. The moment fear is seen clearly, it begins to shrink. A wise man learns that fear is rarely about the present moment. It is about projection. It imagines future pain and reacts to it as if it is already happening. It borrows images from the past and paints them onto the future. And because the body responds to imagined threats almost the same way it responds to real ones, fear feels urgent and real. But urgency is not accuracy. When a man slows down and looks directly at his fear, he begins to notice its structure. He asks simple questions. What exactly am I afraid of losing? What am I assuming will happen? What evidence am I using? These questions do not fight fear, they illuminate it. And fear cannot survive prolonged illumination. Often, fear is not warning you of danger, it is warning you of change. Change threatens familiarity. And the mind prefers familiarity, even when it is uncomfortable, over uncertainty, even when uncertainty holds growth. This is why fear appears most strongly before moments of expansion, before speaking honestly, before committing fully, before stepping into responsibility, before letting go of an old identity. Fear is not proof that something is wrong. It is proof that something is different. A confused man interprets fear as a stop sign. A wise man interprets it as information. When fear is not examined, it exaggerates. It turns small risks into catastrophic outcomes. It whispers in absolutes. You will fail. You will regret this. You will be exposed. These statements feel convincing because they are vague. They are not tied to specifics. They create emotional weight without clarity. But the moment a man asks for detail, fear struggles. When asked to be precise, it reveals how much of it is assumption rather than fact. Clarity dismantles fear by grounding it. It brings it out of imagination and into reality. And reality is almost always more manageable than imagined disaster. A wise man also understands that fear is physical as much as it is mental. It shows up as tension, shallow breathing, restlessness. When he notices these sensations without panic, they begin to settle. He does not interpret them as danger. He interprets them as signals. The body is preparing for something unfamiliar, not something fatal. This distinction matters. Fear wants to be interpreted as threat. Clarity reframes it as transition. Another reason fear loses power when seen clearly is that it is rarely about what it claims to be about. A man may think he fears failure, but what he truly fears is judgment. He may think he fears rejection, but what he truly fears is abandonment. He may think he fears responsibility, but what he truly fears is losing control of his image. When these deeper fears remain unnamed, they control behavior. When they are named, they can be addressed. A named fear can be worked with. An unnamed fear controls from the shadows. A wise man does not shame himself for fear. Shame feeds fear. He understands that fear is part of being human. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is clarity in the presence of fear. When a man sees fear clearly, he stops arguing with it. He stops trying to convince himself that he is not afraid. That internal argument drains energy and keeps fear active. Instead, he acknowledges it. This is fear, simple, honest, grounded. That acknowledgement alone often reduces intensity, because fear feeds on resistance. When it is allowed to exist without being obeyed, it loses urgency. Clarity also reveals something important. Fear cannot predict outcomes. It can only predict discomfort. It has no access to how strong you will become, how much you will learn, or how circumstances will evolve. It only knows what has hurt before, and it assumes repetition. A wise man does not allow the past to veto the future. When fear is seen clearly, decision-making changes. Instead of asking, "How do I avoid fear?" a man asks, "What choice aligns with who I am becoming?" Fear may still be present, but it no longer decides direction. This is where real freedom begins. Over time, as a man repeatedly faces fear with clarity rather than avoidance, the mind learns a new lesson. It learns that fear does not equal catastrophe. It learns that discomfort is survivable. It learns that action does not lead to destruction. And fear's intensity decreases naturally, not because it was crushed, but because it was proven inaccurate. A wise man also understands that fear never fully disappears, and it does not need to. Fear keeps a man alert. It sharpens awareness, but it must be placed in the right role. Advisor, not ruler. When fear is unclear, it rules. When fear is clear, it advises. This is the difference between paralysis and progress. A man who sees fear clearly walks forward with steadiness, not recklessly, not blindly, but honestly. He does not pretend bravery. He practices clarity, and clarity turns fear from a wall into a doorway. The moment a man stops running from fear and starts seeing it for what it truly is, its power begins to dissolve. Let me offer you a truth that many men resist at first, because it asks them to release something they have relied on for years. Real self-mastery does not come from force. It does not come from domination, suppression, or constant self-control. Those methods look powerful on the surface, but they are exhausting and fragile. True self-mastery grows from awareness, because only awareness allows a man to lead himself instead of wrestling with himself. Force creates tension. Awareness creates direction. A man who relies on force is always fighting something inside himself. He fights impulses, emotions, thoughts, and reactions. He tightens his jaw, holds his breath, and pushes through. This can work for a while. It can produce short bursts of discipline, moments of control, even periods of success. But it comes at a cost. The man becomes rigid, and what is rigid eventually breaks. Force does not resolve inner conflict. It silences it temporarily. And what is silenced without being understood returns stronger, usually at the worst possible moment. Awareness works differently. Awareness does not try to overpower what arises inside you. It tries to understand it. And understanding changes the relationship entirely. When a man becomes aware of his inner patterns, he no longer needs to fight them blindly. He can guide them. Most men believe mastery means never feeling weakness, fear, or temptation. That belief keeps them trapped, because the moment something uncomfortable appears, they assume they are failing, so they push harder. They judge themselves, they apply more force, and the cycle continues. A wise man understands that mastery is not about eliminating inner experiences. It is about relating to them skillfully. Awareness allows a man to see what is happening inside him in real time. He notices when impatience rises. He notices when anger tightens his chest. He CES, when ego wants to defend, impress, or dominate. And because he notices, he gains choice. Without awareness, there is no choice. There is only reaction. Force reacts. Awareness responds. A man who lives by force is always late. He reacts after the emotion has already taken control. He speaks after anger has already shaped his words. He withdraws after fear has already decided for him. Awareness arrives earlier. It catches the movement at its beginning. This is why awareness feels subtle but is incredibly powerful. It intervenes before damage is done. A wise man does not wait until he has said something he regrets or made a decision he must undo. He notices the internal shift before it becomes action. That noticing is self-mastery. Awareness also removes the need for constant self-criticism. A man who relies on force often punishes himself mentally. He believes harshness will produce discipline, but harshness creates resistance. Resistance drains energy. Awareness, on the other hand, is neutral. It sees clearly without attacking, and because it does not create inner opposition, it conserves strength. This is why awareness leads to consistency, while force leads to burnout. Another quiet truth is this: force requires constant effort, but awareness becomes easier with practice. The more a man observes himself honestly, the more natural it becomes. He no longer has to try to control himself. He understands himself, and understanding guides behavior effortlessly. The S does not mean life becomes passive. On the contrary, action becomes cleaner. Decisions become simpler. A man stops wasting energy fighting himself and starts using energy to build, to act, to create. Awareness also humbles a man in the right way. He stops pretending he is beyond certain emotions or impulses. He accepts his humanity without surrendering to it. This balance is maturity. A man who masters himself through awareness knows when to step back and when to step forward. He knows when an impulse needs expression and when it needs restraint. He knows the difference between discipline and suppression, and that difference is everything. Force treats all impulses as enemies. Awareness distinguishes between them. This is why awareness produces wisdom. Wisdom is not knowledge, it is discernment, and discernment cannot exist without seeing clearly. A wise man also understands that awareness must be ongoing. It is not a moment of insight that lasts forever. It is a practice. Some days he will be more aware than others. This does not discourage him. He simply returns. Each return strengthens the habit of self-leadership. Over time, something profound happens. The inner struggle softens, not because the man has crushed it, but because it no longer needs to shout to be noticed. The mind feels heard. The emotions feel acknowledged. And when internal parts are acknowledged, they stop demanding control. This is inner peace, not silence but cooperation. A man who masters himself through awareness becomes steady. Not because nothing affects him, but because he understands what affects him. He is no longer surprised by his reactions. He is no longer ashamed of his emotions. He is no longer afraid of his thoughts. And because he is no longer fighting himself, his strength becomes available for life. This is the great irony. Most men never learn. Force makes you feel powerful, but awareness makes you powerful. And when a man chooses awareness over force, he finally stops battling himself and starts leading himself. Let me leave you with something subtle but decisive. Control inside a man does not survive where there is clarity. It cannot. It needs confusion the way a shadow needs darkness. The moment light enters fully, the shadow has nowhere to stand. A clear mind is not an aggressive mind. It does not shout, threaten, or dominate. It simply sees, and what is clearly seen loses its ability to command. Most inner control does not come from strength or intelligence. It comes from fog, from mixed signals, from unresolved questions, from half-understood fears. When a man does not understand why he feels what he feels, those feelings begin to steer him. When he does not understand where his thoughts come from, those thoughts begin to lead him. Control is born in the absence of clarity. Clarity, then, is not something extra a man adds to his life. It is something he removes obstacles to. A wise man learns to simplify his inner world, not by pressing complexity, but by untangling it. He separates what is real from what is imagined. He distinguishes between what is happening now and what is remembered from the past. He learns the difference between intuition and impulse, between caution and fear, between confidence and ego. Each distinction weakens inner control. Confusion blends everything together. It makes old wounds feel like present threats. It makes passing emotions feel like permanent truths. It makes temporary thoughts feel like identity. Clarity separates, and separation restores order. A clear mind does not argue with every thought. It observes patterns. It notices repetition. It sees how certain ideas arrive at predictable moments, how certain emotions surface in familiar situations. And once a pattern is seen, it loses its authority. Patterns control only what they remain unconscious. This is why clarity requires honesty. Not moral honesty, but perceptual honesty. A man must be willing to admit what is actually happening inside him, not what he wishes were happening. He must be willing to see his avoidance, his pride, his fear of discomfort, not with judgment, but with precision. Precision dissolves control. A vague mind is easily influenced. A precise mind is grounded. When clarity deepens, a man no longer needs to ask himself constantly what he should do. Action emerges naturally. He sees consequences more clearly. He senses alignment. He recognizes when something is pulling him away from himself instead of toward himself. This is inner freedom. Not the freedom to do anything, but the freedom from being internally manipulated. A clear mind also ends the inner noise that drains so many men. When thoughts are examined instead of believed automatically, their volume decreases. When emotions are understood instead of resisted, they pass more quickly. The mind becomes quieter not by force, but by resolution. Silence comes from clarity, not suppression. And in that silence, something important appears. Presence. A man becomes fully where he is. He listens better. He speaks less impulsively. He responds instead of reacts. Life stops feeling like a constant internal negotiation. Inner control thrives on distraction. Clarity brings attention back to the moment, and the moment is always simpler than the stories built around it. A wise man knows this. You cannot be controlled by what you are fully present with. Presence dissolves inner tyranny. Clarity also strengthens humility. A man sees his limitations without being crushed by them. He sees his strengths without inflating them. He no longer needs to prove himself constantly, because he understands himself. And understanding removes the hunger for validation. Many men are controlled by the need to be seen, admired, feared, or approved. A clear mind sees these needs for what they are, signals, not commands. And once seen, they stop dictating behavior. Clarity gives a man space between stimulus and response. That space is everything. In that space, character is chosen, integrity is practiced, wisdom becomes visible. And this space cannot be forced open. It appears naturally when perception sharpens. This is why clarity is a daily discipline, not a one-time achievement. A wise man returns to it again and again. He questions assumptions. He checks his inner state. He notices when fog begins to form and gently clears it, instead of charging forward blindly. He understands that a moment of confusion does not make him weak. Staying confused does. As clarity becomes a habit, inner control fades quietly, not with drama, not with resistance, but with irrelevance. It no longer has leverage. It no longer has ambiguity to exploit. The man becomes internally sovereign, and when a man reaches this place, he does not need to fight anything inside himself anymore, because there is nothing left hiding in the dark. A clear mind leaves no space for inner control, and in that clarity, the man finally stands free.